Good afternoon, everyone. So how many of you guys have worked at a minimum wage job? So most of us. So the goal of many Americans is to one day be able to live independently and be able to support those around them. This is why poverty is such a concerning issue. The minimum wage is devised to set a minimum standard of living. It is the lowest wage rate allowed by law. Currently, there are 18 states looking to increase their minimum wage, with California being one of them. I propose that raising the minimum wage will lead to an increase of poverty. Here are my 3 main points. Employers will not be able to support as many workers if the minimum wage were to increase. Second, raising the minimum wage would increase the price of consumer goods. And third, teenagers and young adults will face increasingly harder times finding jobs. My first point, employers will not be able to support as many workers if the minimum wage were to increase. An increase in the minimum wage would devastate low-skilled workers. According to James Dorn, the Vice President of Monetary Studies at Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., a 10% increase of the minimum wage leads to approximately 3% decrease of low-skill unemployment in the short run and longer decreases in the long run. The loss of jobs will not only affect low-skilled workers. The Congressional Budget Office states that a projected 500,000 jobs will be lost. In a survey consisting of 1,200 businesses, 38% of employers said that they would lay off employees, and 54% said that they would decrease their hiring rates. With more people being without jobs, the amount of those affected by poverty would increase. My second point, raising the minimum wage would increase the price of consumer goods. Food prices would face a substantial increase. A study conducted by Purdue University states that there will be an approximately 4.3% increase in restaurant food prices if the minimum wage were to increase to $15 an hour. Low-income workers are hit the hardest by increasing prices. This defeats the purpose of increasing the minimum wage. Because we all participate in buying consumer goods, the increase of prices of consumer goods would affect all of us, not just low-skilled workers. The premise of increasing the minimum wage is to help those suffering from poverty. However, this change will only work if we assume that companies and institutions are willing to give up their earnings to continue to pay their workers and keep the same prices. My third point, teenagers and young adults will face increasingly harder times finding jobs. Casey B. Mulligan, the economics professor at the University of Chicago, stated that after the minimum wage increase of 2009, the teen unemployment rate fell 8% within just 3 months of the change. This change will not only affect those currently in poverty, but will also affect those looking to be hired at a minimum wage job. In conclusion, raising the minimum wage would lead to an increase of poverty because employers will not be able to support as many workers. Raising the minimum wage would increase the price of consumer goods, and teenagers and young adults will face increasingly harder times finding jobs. Instead of increasing the minimum wage, I propose a solution. Instead of raising the minimum wage, we as a nation should focus our efforts into creating more jobs for lower to working class Americans. Thank you.
You can give me that outline back?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
All right. Okay.
I also sent you a copy in your email.
The propositions identified clearly. There's a good preview of the supporting structure, and you signpost in the body of the speech, so the structural things are pretty solid. Your first supporting point is where the most information is in your argument, and there's a variety of information there. You've got an estimate about what the decrease in employment would be given an increase in the cost, okay? You've got an estimate about the number of jobs we're talking about if the minimum wage were to go up. I'm not exactly sure that what that is predicated on the CBO study, what the amount of increase is that's going to get us to lose 500,000 jobs. And then the survey of the employers suggesting that more than a third of them would lay people off, and more than half of them would lower the number of people that they hired. That's pretty good information, suggesting that your first point on employment seems to be solid. Like I said, that's where the meat of the evidence is in your argument. When you get to the second point, it's a little bit thinner because you're talking about consumer prices going up. The best example that you have is if we increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which is about the highest that anybody's talking about, restaurant prices would increase 4.3%. Well, depending upon the restaurant, 4.3% seems like it's something that wouldn't be all that harmful to folks. There's not any contrasting information about who's going to benefit from the $15 an hour wage that they're now paid. So I think that you need to do a little bit more in developing that. The idea that these increases in prices are going to have a harmful effect on the people that are most in need of assistance because of the minimum wage, I think that's the part where you need to do a little bit more as well, because the idea is that people who are well off can afford to pay the increased prices. If I'm going to a restaurant and I'm relatively stable in my income, a 4.3% increase, well, for $100 restaurant bill, that's $4.30. And if I'm buying a meal for $100, for a family, something like that, $4.30 doesn't seem like it's that much. But for a family that's doing less well, a percentage of that comes out of their income level, and it might put a bigger stretch on them. And I think you could explain that a little bit more and show that that argument is really counterproductive, which is basically the position that you're taking in that whole first point. It was a little bit confusing because on the last point, when you're talking about youth unemployment, you had a statistic that you presented, and it did not come across very clearly. It sounded to me like you said when the last wage increase went into effect, that the unemployment rate dropped 8%. If it dropped 8%, that's a good thing. If it went up 8%, the unemployment rate went up 8%. That's the thing that I think you're talking about, it being potentially harmful, and the way it was presented, it was not very clear. I'm assuming that it's the negative relationship that you're trying to describe there, but it's better to have a direct quote, and that's one of the places that is a good analysis or a good indication of that, a good illustration of that particular point. There's a little bit of reading, and it's kind of mechanical. The speech is short, so you had plenty of time to do a little bit more on each of those second and third points, and I think you probably could have even added a little bit more to the first point, although you had good evidence there. All right, the solution thing, I think you're off track there. That deals with a different issue. All right, thank you.